Today, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding testing your JavaScript application using Cypress. And not only that, but you're going to be able to see my dog, Ragnar, in the background quite a bit as well. So with that, we aren't going to cover every single little thing and bore you with every little detail of Cypress. I'm going to cover the fundamentals to get you up and running that will allow you to use Cypress to test your professional applications in JavaScript. I've been using Cypress the last 3 or 4 years in my professional job. So I think that this is going to help you out a ton. And I'm going to go over the fundamentals of what you need to know and some best practices so you can use it well for your job. Now, the only prerequisite for this course is basic web development knowledge. So JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. If you have the fundamentals down for those, you can take this course. Now with that, we are going to be writing Cypress tests in this course for a Next.js application. Now, Next.js is not a prerequisite for this course, as everything I go over, it's more so just going to be JavaScript specific, not Next.js specific. So whether you want to test a just vanilla JavaScript app or an Angular or Vue or Svelte or whatever it might be, this will apply to everything because we're going to focus on the fundamentals and principles of Cypress. So you can apply those principles to whatever JavaScript application you decide to test here, okay? Now, let's kind of dive into the course a little bit and what we're going to kind of cover here. So I've created a custom Next.js application here or website for this course in which you can visit that. I'm sure that will be linked in the description here below, but you can visit that at https://cypress-course.vercel.app, okay? And once you visit this website, you're going to see that this is basically an outline of the course, but we're also going to use this website to write our Cypress tests. We're going to write tests for this website. So for this, we're going to cover why Cypress. So different reasons on why Cypress is a good idea here. We're going to just do an overview and an install of our app. So I'm going to have you clone a repo of mine, and then we're going to install dependencies and move forward with that. Then we're going to focus on some testing fundamentals of Cypress. And we're going to get into what are describe blocks, it blocks, commands, interacting with things, different things like that. Then we're going to cover some stuff that is good to know regarding forms. And we have this input here that we are going to actually write tests for and a little subscribe button as well. And then we're going to get into some other just general examples that I've kind of found helpful and some use cases that I think will be good for you to know about. So multi-page testing using intercepts and other kind of helpful Cypress methods that I think are helpful to know. And then we're going to get into component testing. So Cypress is a end-to-end testing framework. So it focuses on just end-to-end workflows for your user, not necessarily writing tests in isolation for a specific JavaScript component that you have. But sometimes you don't necessarily want to write tests for complete end-to-end. You want to test a specific component. And for that, Cypress provides a really good way to do that as well. So we'll cover component testing as well. And then we're going to end with some different best practices here. So 8 different best practices that I think will help make your Cypress tests a lot better and help you have a much easier time with that. So with that, I think that we are ready to kind of head into the first segment here of why Cypress. So why might you actually want to use Cypress for your testing of JavaScript applications? Well, the first reason is because Cypress is an all-in-one testing framework. It has an assertion library as well as it provides ways of doing different mocks and stubs for different functions and stuff like that. So gone are the days of when you would test a JavaScript application, you'd have to install like 7 different libraries, one that does the kind of testing framework itself, one that is a specific assertion library, one that does mocking and stubbing. Cypress does all of that for you. So you basically, and you'll see it in our install here, you basically just install Cypress and everything else is already taken care of for you. So you don't have to install a bunch of different libraries and packages for it. Reason number 2 I like Cypress is because it focuses on kind of end-to-end and component testing in more of a real world environment. So you can actually like write end-to-end tests, testing your entire application in different workflows that the user is actually going to be going through, rather than just writing unit tests and isolation that, you know, sometimes you write tests and it's not even a particular situation that the user will go through. You're more so writing tests to make sure that your tests are working. So Cypress does a really good job of focusing on things that the user is actually going to be interacting with and different things like that, to where I think it's much more real world than potentially some other solutions out there. And then also, it runs in the browser and it's wrote in JavaScript. So since it's wrote in JavaScript, it's great for testing JavaScript applications. You don't have to go and learn a completely different language or different syntax for writing these tests. It's basically just writing them in JavaScript, and if you know JavaScript, you'll pick this up very quickly. And it also runs in the browser, which has some benefits, which we'll show you here just in a little bit. And also generally has pretty good performance, and it can be integrated into a continuous integration or continuous development environment quite easily. We recently did this for our professional lab, to where we run our Cypress tests after we merge a pull request to our kind of main branch as well. So that can be integrated, and you can get code coverage and all that stuff as well. So you can be notified right away if your code coverage goes down after a certain PR, or you can know right away when you merge a PR if certain tests start failing. It's very helpful to do. So it's good with that sort of thing. You also have native access to the DOM and to your app. So you can inspect your Cypress tests, like debug them, similar to how you would debug a regular JavaScript application. And then also within the Cypress test runner, you have access to your application, which means that when you're writing tests, once a test stops, you can, within the Cypress runner, just go use your application and go and find things. That is super helpful. So you don't have to keep going back and forth between your test runner and your actual app to kind of know what you're testing. You have access to it in the test runner, which, if that doesn't make sense, it'll make sense here in just a little bit. And then also, I personally think there's a great developer experience for Cypress. I have used it, like I said, for a few years now, and I really enjoy using it. I think that for testing libraries, like if you're willing to use it for a handful of years, it must be pretty solid. So that's good. And then also, it's generally not flaky if you follow the best practices. There's definitely ways that you could write Cypress tests that does make them flaky, but if you follow the best practices, you can generally have non-flaky tests. And what I mean by flaky is that you have tests that, you run your testing suite once, all of your tests pass. You run it again, a few of them fail. You run it again, they all pass. So they just have tests that don't always pass, and they're just kind of flaky. They sometimes pass, sometimes don't. I don't tend to run into that when using some of the best practices that Cypress recommends here. Okay. So now, with that kind of overview on why you might want to use Cypress, let's kind of get into actually getting you set up with this project so we can start actually testing with Cypress. So the very first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to clone this repository. So I'm going to copy this command here, git clone, and then the name of my repository. And I'm sure that we'll have my GitHub where you can find this linked below. I will have kind of this starter repository here in which we are going to write our tests. And then I will also include a kind of final project that has all my tests written, so you can kind of see the before and after. So you can see the Cypress course, and then I'll have like Cypress course final that you can see the kind of final things there. And I'll have those linked below, but I'm going to copy this here. So git clone https://github.com CodeRyanSolomon/Cypress course.git. And then I'm going to go into VS Code here, and within Visual Studio Code, I'm going to open up my terminal, and I'm in a folder called Cyclone Final. You can name this folder whatever you want, but just be in a certain folder that you want this project to be in. And then I'm going to paste that command of git clone, and then it's going to clone into my repository. And now that I have cloned my repository, if I look at my folders, I see I have my Cypress course. So I'm going to cd into my Cypress course here. And then now once I'm in my Cypress course, we're going to go back here and we're going to install the dependencies. So npm install. So I'm going to run that within my Cypress course folder, and that's going to install some different dependencies that I used for this project. I use like Material UI a little bit to just write some different components and stuff like that. So we can see that I'm now in my Cypress course and I've installed my dependencies. So if I go to my project navigator over here and I open up Cypress course, you're going to see that it's a Next.js application. So I use the latest version of Next.js that uses the app router. So I have my app right here, and then I have my different folders in Next.js. Each folder represents a route. If you have a page.js within that folder, but we don't need to get into Next.js here, you could check out CodeRide on YouTube to check out my channel in which I cover Next.js a bit more. But here you can see that we have our best practices page. We have some various components. We have our component testing page, examples, fundamentals, stuff like that. We're not going to get into the kind of project itself a whole bunch. We're going to focus on Cypress. But if you want to learn more about Next.js, as I said, you can go check out my channel there. But with that, we have our dependencies installed here. But now let's actually run our application. So let's do npm run dev here in the terminal. So that should start my app here at localhost 3000. So if I go back here, you're actually going to see that when navigating to localhost 3000, you see that this is indeed the website I was just showing you. So this is my deployed website, and this is at my localhost 3000 here. So this is the app that we're going to test, and it's also the app that I use as an outline for this course here. Okay. So that should start it up right here. So with that, I'm going to go back to the overview page here within localhost 3000. Now that we've run our app, let's now install Cypress. So I'm going to do npm install cypress --save -dev. So I'm going to copy this here, and then I'm going to go back. I'm going to open up another terminal here because my other one's running. And then I'm going to make sure that since I'm still in my Cyclone final, I'm going to still cd into Cypress course here. And then I'm going to run my npm install Cypress command. So I've now installed Cypress here after just a second. And now that I have Cypress installed, and as you can see, we just had to install one package to get Cypress all installed here. And the configuration of Cypress is actually quite easy as well. So let's go back here. And now the final step is to open the Cypress test runner and configure Cypress. So I'm going to run npx cypress open here in my terminal. And this is effectively going to open Cypress up in a test runner. And as you see here, you get a pop-up window that says, welcome to Cypress. And right now we're going to focus on end-to-end testing, but in the future, we're going to go to component testing here. So I want you to click on end-to-end testing. And then once you do, you're going to see that Cypress is automatically going to configure your Cypress project here. So it's automatically going to add these different files to your Cypress project. So it's going to add a Cypress config.js, a Cypress support /end-to-end.js, a Cypress support commands. So creating custom commands in Cypress, which we'll definitely touch on in this course. And then you also have a Cypress fixtures folder, which we'll cover kind of what you could use fixtures for here later on as well. So with that, all you need to do to configure Cypress is press continue. And bada bing, it already does it. I don't know why I just said bada bing. I think that's like a phrase from, I don't know, the 90s. I was barely alive in the 90s, but we're going to start this in Chrome here. And as you can see, it opens up this Cypress test runner here. And what it's saying is like, hey, you don't have any spec files, another name for any test files. You don't have any tests right now. So what you can do here is we can create a new spec. So here I want you to click on create new spec. And then once we click on that, it's going to add a spec file or a test file within our Cypress /end-to-end /spec.sci.js. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to call this fundamentals.sci.js, as we're soon going to move on to the fundamentals page and start actually writing some tests and talking about Cypress fundamentals. So I'm going to name this fundamentals right here. I'm going to click create spec. And then I'm going to press OK, run the spec. And here it created just a example test for us. And now we can set this test up on our website and actually get into the fundamentals of Cypress. But before we get to the fundamentals, just to show you what happened here within our project, Cypress automatically added some folders into our project. So within my project here, right next to my app directory, Cypress added this folder called Cypress. And within this Cypress folder, it added a few more folders. So we have an end-to-end folder, and that's where our fundamentals.sci.js folder is. So this is the spec file that we just created using Cypress. When we clicked create file and we named this fundamentals, it went into our Cypress end-to-end fundamentals folder. Just to be clear, I did not just go and make all these folders. Cypress did all this automatically for us when we clicked to configure these files. And then it also adds a fixtures folder in which it gives us just an example fixture, and we can get into this a bit later. And then it also gave us a support folder where we can write our custom commands here and do some other kind of configuration things as well. Now, not only this, but it also adds a cypress.config.js folder to our root of our application that we can also use to kind of set up different configuration things that we will also do here later on, okay? So Cypress automatically added all this stuff for us. We didn't have to add a single thing. We can already, now that we use that Cypress configurator, we can already dive into our Cypress folder and our end-to-end test and get into this fundamentals test and start writing tests. We didn't have to add any other configuration other than that. So Cypress, as you can see, it's super easy to get set up in your projects. You just install the package, you open it up, run the configuration, it does it for you automatically, and you can start writing your tests. So next up, we're going to get into the fundamentals of Cypress. This might look a little bit forward to you. You have a describe block, an it block, a sci.visit. How is all this working? We're going to now cover that here in the fundamentals section. So here on the fundamentals page of Cypress, the very first thing that we're going to cover here is the describe blocks in Cypress, in which all of your tests or your tests within test file, they're going to exist in a describe block. And this describe block takes two arguments. The first is just going to be a string that is describing your test file. And the second is going to be a callback function in which you're going to actually have your tests. Okay, so if we go back to my code editor here, what you're going to see is that within fundamentals.sci.js, we have this overall describe block right here, in which the first argument to this describe block is a string. So instead of just naming this template spec, I'm going to name this fundamentals test. Okay. And then the second argument to this describe block is a function, a callback function. So passing a function into another function in JavaScript is called a callback function. So I'm passing a function as a second argument, and within the body of this second argument here, or this function that I pass in as a second argument, this is going to contain all of my tests. And within this body of this function here, you see that I now have an it block. So this is very similar, in which it's fundamental number 2. Within your describe block, you also have it blocks. It blocks will be single tests within an overall test file. The API for it, or the way that you use a it block, is very similar to a describe block. The first argument is the title of an individual test, and the second argument is a callback function containing your test code. So your overall test, or your test file, is described by your describe block. And then as a second argument to your describe block, you pass a function. And within the body of that function, it's going to contain your individual tests for your overall describe block file here. So my describe block is my fundamentals test. I'm going to test my fundamentals page. And then my it block, that's going to be for individual tests for my fundamentals page. So here you can see I have it, and then I'm calling my it function here from Cypress, and then I'm passing in a string as my first argument, just like I do for my describe block here. And then my second argument is going to be a callback function, or a function, in which the body of that function is going to contain my test code here. And you can see this is a Cypress command that I'm using right here, which we'll get to in just a second. All right. So within the test file, you're going to wrap all of your tests in a describe block describing what this test file is going to test. And then within that describe block, you are then going to create it blocks that are going to be your individual tests for that overall file. All right. Now, I alluded to it just a second ago, but we also have commands and interacting with elements. So Cypress gives you various commands to help you write your tests. And you can use these commands on the Sci object. So Cypress makes a Sci object available to you that is kind of globally available within your Cypress test that you can use, and it gives you different helper methods on that object that you can use to perform different actions or to test some different things and stuff like that. So for example, you can use the sci.visit command. So you're accessing the Sci object that Cypress gives you, which is globally available. You don't need to import it at all. And then you can access the visit method on that object, and that can help you perform navigation throughout your project. So sci.visit / is going to visit the kind of root of whatever you set as your base URL. And we will cover setting a base URL here in just a second as well. But sci.visit / like I said, it will navigate to your homepage or your root URL for whatever is your base URL. And then you have various other commands like sci.click, sci.type, sci.check, so on and so forth. And if we look at their docs here in their actionability section, you can see that they give various commands like click, double click, right click, type, clear, check, uncheck, select, trigger, basically any commands that a user can perform on their keyboard or with their mouse. Cypress is going to give you that on the Sci object. So if we look at my code here, you can see that within my it block, this is going to contain my test code, and I do sci.visit https:// example.cypress.io. And what this is going to do is it's going to navigate my test to this URL here. So that's why we see that my test runner right now is pointing to example.cypress.io. But we don't want to test example.cypress.io. We want to test our actual web page here. So the way that we can do this is, instead of doing sci.visit this example.io, we can actually make sure to visit localhost :3000 / fundamentals. So if I copy our URL for our running app, and note, you must have your dev server running for Cypress to work here. I'll just show you. I'll shut down my dev server. So hold on, let me go back. And now I'm going to do sci.visit. Instead of this URL, I'm going to have it visit localhost :3000 / fundamentals. And now if I go back to my runner, you see that it now lands on my fundamentals page here. However, if I go back to my dev server here and I shut it down and I kill my server, and then I try to go back here and I refresh, I'm going to get, sorry, we could not load localhost :3000 / fundamentals. So you need to have your dev server running for Cypress to work here, because you do get access to your live running app here. I think that this should now work when I reload it, and now my page is up and running again. Okay, so just be aware of that. And one thing to keep in mind when using these different Cypress commands here is that Cypress does have an asynchronous nature. So what I mean by that is, heading to the Cypress docs here, it mentions that this is one of the most crucial concepts to understand when using Cypress, as Cypress handles things kind of asynchronously. So Cypress commands do not return their subjects. This means you cannot do things like using, and we'll talk about getting elements here in just a second, But if you do something like sci.get button and you would try to assign that value to a button variable, that will not work. And it mentions this is one of the primary reasons they don't recommend using variables within your test. Instead, Cypress commands yield their subjects. So Cypress commands are asynchronous and get queued for execution at a later time. While commands are executed, their subjects are yielded from one command to the next, similar to how like a JavaScript generator function would work. If you want more information on generator functions, it's not something I'm going to cover here. It's a little bit more kind of complex part, but I definitely have a video on that on my channel. But this is because a lot of helpful Cypress code runs between each command to ensure everything is in order. So instead of doing something like this, you can actually use .thens, similar to how you would do like promise chaining. So it says, so if a command does not return a subject, but instead yields it, how can you interact with the subject directly? Well, you can use a .then. And .then behaves, very similarly, like I said, how promises work in JavaScript. However, .then is a Cypress command, not a promise. This means you cannot use things like async await within your Cypress tests. Whatever is returned from a callback function becomes the new subject and will flow into the following command. So if you do something like getting a button and you want to use that button within your tests, then you would call a .then and you'd be passed the kind of HTML button element, and then you can make an assertion within your .then block. Okay, because Cypress is asynchronous when it's doing its different commands. And then it says when undefined is returned by the callback function, the subject will not be modified and will instead carry over into the next command. Just like promises, you can return any compatible thenable, so anything that has a .then interface, and Cypress will wait for that to resolve before continuing forward in your chain of commands, similar to how promises work. Now you can also use .wrap. So in the example above, the button is a jQuery object. This means that if we would like Cypress to perform some action on it, we first need to use sci.wrap for Cypress to interact with it. So for example, they would have to use sci.wrap around that button object, and then they could click on it, and then they could make a certain assertion. So they say in this example, they're first getting the button element, but then they are wrapping it with sci.wrap because they need to make it into a Cypress object rather than just a button element that's returned from the DOM here. So like it says here, they need to wrap it because it provides necessary Cypress context to make these different assertions on it. Okay, so if you do use a .then and then you want to make an assertion on that element specifically, you need to wrap that first in sci.wrap. Okay, most of the time you don't need to use a .then and then make an assertion on that button. And we will cover how to make assertions and we'll go through examples in the future. But most of the time you don't need to do this. Every once in a while though, you do. So it's helpful to know that Cypress is asynchronous and you shouldn't just use a variable like it shows here at the top. And if you want access to a native like element on the DOM, you should use a .then. And then if you want to make a Cypress assertion, you should wrap that element in a sci.wrap. Okay, so a little bit of a trickier part here, but I would say just know that this is a thing that you need to do. If you need direct access to an element, usually you don't, and you can kind of get away with not doing this. But if you do need it, just know that this is how it should be done rather than just assigning it to a variable and moving forward thinking that everything is just synchronous in Cypress. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. But moving back here, let's now move to getting elements. So I kind of touched on this just a little bit in that example, but like I mentioned here, you're often going to want to get an element from the DOM and make some sort of assertion. For example, my H1 element contains a certain text. So I might want to assert that this title here says testing the fundamentals. And you can get elements in Cypress by using the get function and pass a CSS query selector. Okay. Now I will show you an example of this here in just a second, but the way that you query for elements in Cypress is using sci.get, and then as an argument that you pass into sci.get, it's going to be a string that is a CSS query selector to get whatever element that you want. So knowing CSS is definitely helpful for using Cypress, which is why I mentioned at the kind of intro that it's helpful to know some just basic web development when using Cypress, like CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, because you're going to be querying for HTML elements and kind of interacting with them as well. And then command chaining and assertions. So after you get an element, you probably want to do something with that element, like make an assertion. So you can do this by chaining on an assertion after getting an element. For example, you might get your H1 element with side.get, and then as soon as you get that element, you might call .contains text. And Cypress has various ways of making assertions. So if we look at their assertions here, you can see that Cypress bundles the chai assertion library as well as the side-on and jQuery, bringing you a ton of very powerful assertions right out of the box. You don't need to go and install chai and side-on and all these different libraries. You can use them. Cypress does this for you automatically. So for example, and you definitely don't need to memorize every single Cypress assertion. I definitely don't. I've been using Cypress in my professional application for the last 3 or 4 years, and I don't know if I remember any assertions off the top of my head. Like side.contains contains a certain text. This is basically what I remember, but I will often just use ChatGPT and be like, hey, how do I make a Cypress assertion to say that this element does not exist in my DOM? And ChatGPT will just write that assertion. Or you could go the old-fashioned route and just look at their docs and find out. And sometimes that's useful because ChatGPT, currently recording this in July 2023, it only goes back to, I think, 2021. So anything the last couple of years, it might not know. So it still can be helpful to look at the docs as well. But just know that you can come to the docs and look at their assertions, and you can see all these different assertions they have. So you can chain on, like after you get an element, you can say it .should not equal a certain value. You can say all the keys should have a certain name and value. You can say that something should exist. You could say that something should be undefined or should be .null. You could say that something has different arguments. So you can see there's a ton of different assertions here. Pretty much any assertion that you can think of, it's going to be included in these different assertions here. Okay. So you can come and look through all these assertions if you would like, but as you can see, we have a ton. So even for functions, you can do stuff like .should have been called. You can have been called once, have been called twice, have been called with certain values, a whole bunch of different assertions in here. Okay. So if you want to learn all about Cypress assertions, you can come here, but just know that they have a ton. And if there's something that you particularly want to do, you can come to this page and find that assertion for the most part. But you can add new assertions by extending the chai assertions, and it's kind of documented here within their docs. I'm not going to get into that too much because Cypress already has so many assertions, but just know you can add your own assertions if there's something that isn't available to you. And here's some examples of some common assertions in Cypress. So you might use side.get to get a list item that has a class called selected. So just like I mentioned earlier, and we'll head into our code editor and write this code in just a second. But here it's using the sci object. It's calling .get to get an element. And then as an argument to sci.get, you are going to pass it a string that is a query selector to get an element from the DOM. So this query selector is going to get all LIs that have a .selected class. And it's asserting that there should be 3 LIs with a selected class. So after you get that element, you chain on .should have length of 3. Okay, so this is saying your LIs, you should have 3 selected LIs on your page. So kind of going back to what I said earlier about you not usually having to assign something to a variable and then using a .then, because you can just chain on .should have length of 3. I don't need to say .then and then get my elements and then assert that these elements have a length of 3. I can just chain on my assertions here. And then similar to here, it's getting a form. So sci.get form. and then it's going to find the input within that form, and then it's going to say .should not have class of disabled. So it's saying the input in my form should not have a class of disabled. So this is a good example of the chaining nature of Cypress. Similar to promise chaining, you're first going to get the form, and then you're immediately going to chain on the .find input to get the input of that form, and then you're going to chain on your assertion .should not have a class of disabled here. Okay. And then also you can make different assertions for values. So it's getting this text area element, and then it's saying .should have value of foobar baz. And then here below, this is getting text content. So it's getting an element that has a data-test ID, which we will get to test IDs in just a second. It's a test ID of username, and then it's saying it should have a certain text of Joe Smith. And it is a very similar thing for these examples below. And then to test a visibility, you can use side.get to get a certain element, and then you can say .should be visible. So you should be able to see this on your page at this point of time during your testing suite. And you can also do should not be visible. Now, sometimes you don't want to test visibility, you want to test existence. And the way that you can do that is should not exist. And then you can also test certain states of an element. So this is getting radio buttons here, and it's saying that they should be checked within your DOM. And then you can also test different CSS properties. So it should have class of text decoration as well as line through. And then for this element here, it's saying it should not have certain CSS. And then you can also test that certain properties are enabled or disabled by using should be enabled or should not be enabled. And then you can also use negative assertions. So this is a positive assertion here. So it should have length of 2 and it should have a class of completed. But this one, it's saying it should not have class of completed, and it should not be visible here. All right. So there are a ton of different assertions that you can use here. Hopefully this gives you kind of a rough overview of how you can use assertions and how the chaining works. But I think it'll make much more sense once we kind of write the code for this, which I think that we are ready to do. So let's go back here, and we covered describe blocks, it blocks, command chaining, getting elements, and kind of the fundamentals that we need to start writing kind of our first test here. So let's go ahead, and all we're going to do here is make an assertion that this element right here contains the text content of testing fundamentals. So my favorite way to do this is that since Cypress gives us access to our app here, I can automatically inspect right here, just like I'm inspecting the DOM, and I can say, okay, how should I query for this element? So it's an H1 here. It has the content of testing fundamentals, but I don't really have a great way of getting this element, because in Cypress, you don't want to use like super general selectors, as that can make your test a little bit flaky. And Cypress recommends using a data-test attribute for your elements, as they don't want you to write your tests in a flaky manner, meaning you don't want to write tests that like rely on like a CSS class that can change a lot, because you don't want your test to fail just because a certain class is changed. You want your test to fail when you get an unexpected behavior or an element isn't showing that should be showing. But just because you necessarily selected an element or queried for an element and the class name convention slightly changed, you don't necessarily want the test to break. So they recommend using selectors when you're getting elements that are going to be constant and not change across your tests and not change much over time. So they recommend using data-test attributes. So let's go ahead, and for this testing fundamentals H1 here, let's add a data test attribute, and then we can write a test for this. So let's go back here, and I'm going to go over to my app folder here, and I'm going to go to my fundamentals folder, and we're going to click on page.jsx, and you don't need to know Next.js to do this. As you can see, this looks exactly like HTML. This is technically JSX, but For now, we could just think of it just like HTML. And all I'm going to do is add a data-test attribute. And I'm going to set that to a string called fundamentals-header here. And I'm going to now copy this. Actually, I'm going to copy this whole attribute right here. And then I want to go back to my fundamentals.sci.js. And I'm first going to visit http://locals:3000/fundamentals. But I'm going to actually change this in just a second here. But I'm going to go ahead and do sci.get. And then as my argument here, it's going to be a query selector. So I want to get my data-test attribute. So to get a attribute using query selector, I need to use my square bracket syntax. And I'm going to paste in my data-test is equal to my fundamentals-header. And for my test, well, what do I want to test? I want to test that it contains the text that I expect. So I'm going to do dot contains. So I'm chaining on my assertion here. So I'm saying sci.get this element with a data-test attribute of fundamentals header. And then I'm going to say it contains, and what's the text here that it should contain? Testing fundamentals is the text that it should contain. So if I go back here, I'm going to paste that within my sci.contains, but it should be a string. Well, actually, you could also pass a regular expression into sci.contains. So I'm actually going to pass in / testing fundamentals / and then I'm going to pass an I. So this is making it case insensitive. And I often think that this can be helpful because often you don't really care if I came back and I tested this or changed this to testing and then lowercase f fundamentals because that was more consistent with my app or something like that. I didn't want it to be case sensitive. Then I would pass a regular expression and pass an I here to be case insensitive. So within your contains, I could pass a string. That would be just fine, but you can also pass a regular expression. So I'm getting my fundamentals header, and then I'm saying it contains testing fundamentals. So if I go back to this, you see that my test does indeed pass. Now, I could also do something like this, in which instead of just saying .contains testing fundamentals, I could say .should, and then within my should assertion, I could say contain text, and then I could pass a string testing fundamentals. And I believe that should also still pass here. And it does. It contains the text testing fundamentals. Okay, so hopefully you have written your first successful Cypress kind of assertion there. But one thing I do want to show you is that I don't necessarily want to just do a sci.visit to like this entire URL each time. We can actually configure a base URL within Cypress. So I'm going to go to my cypress.config here, and within my end-to-end property here, I'm going to set a base URL, and I'm going to set that to my localhost 3000 here. So let me grab that. And now I'm going to set my base URL to HTTP localhost :3000. And I'm going to make sure to put a comma there so my syntax isn't broken. And then within my fundamentals test, and it just it reset, since I changed my config, it reloaded my Cypress runner. But I'm going to come back to my test. And now instead of including localhost 3000 here, I'm going to just go to /fundamentals. And I'm going to change my it argument to contains correct header text. And I'm going to probably change this title as well, because in Cypress, it recommends that you don't have a bunch of small little tests within your testing suite, as Cypress does a lot of work between tests, and we'll cover this more in best practices, but Cypress does a lot of work between your tests to kind of clean up different things and add different things and stuff like that. So it actually takes a little bit longer, and it's a little bit less performant for Cypress to do these small individual tests, And it's actually better to kind of write a little bit longer tests. Okay, so just something to keep in mind there. But now I just need to visit /fundamentals since I set my base URL in my Cypress config. And then this should all still work, I believe, unless I did something wrong. So if we go back to fundamentals, you see that it does indeed still work. I still go to localhost 3000 as my base URL, and then I go to my fundamentals page here. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and I want to, let's do a couple of other things. So maybe we'll also we can click on this fundamental number 1 here, and we can assert that that this text exists when we do click on it. But before we click on it, we can assert that this text doesn't exist or that it's not visible. So technically speaking, this text always exists within our DOM, but it's only visible when we click to open this fundamentals block number 1 here, okay? So we're going to get this element. We are going to assert that this text it's not visible. And then we are going to click to open this describe block. And then we're going to assert that it is indeed visible. And then maybe we'll click on it again and assert again that it's no longer visible. So we're confirming that this element does open and close like we expect. Okay, so I think the first thing that we'll have to do here is, well, let me inspect this here, which this is why I love Cypress. I can just inspect my app right here. I don't have to keep going back and forth between my browser and different things like that. So I find that to be super, super helpful. So let's go ahead and if I inspect this first element, you see that it has an ID of panel 1A header, but I do see that, so this is panel 1A header, but this one also has panel 1A header, and this one also has panel 1A header. So that's not going to work. So we're going to have to write a data test ID here, or at least that's what we're going to do. There's different ways you could do this, but that's how we're going to do it here. So if we go back and I go to my fundamentals page, as you can see, I pass all of my items to my items accordion here. So let's go to this items accordion component, and you can see that it takes all of my items and then it maps over those items and it returns an individual accordion block for every item. This is a little bit React specific, so we're not going to worry about it too much. But all that you're going to need to know here is that we need to add a data-test ID for our accordion item right here. So right here within my outer block, I'm going to do data-test, and it needs to be unique for every item. So all I need to do here is set my data-test to my item.id here. And I'm going to actually do a JavaScript string here. So this is just JavaScript specific here. I'm going to say accordion item, and then I'm going to use my item.id. If I now go back to my Cypress runner, I should be able to see that this item right now, we should have an element that has a accordion item 1. So you see that this now has a data-test right here of accordion item 1. So I'm going to get accordion item 1 using sci.get, and then we are going to open it, assert that it has its text, close it, assert that that text is no longer visible. So the way that I want to do this, and the way that I like to write tests in general, is kind of incrementally. So let's first go back here. Let's go to our fundamentals test here. So we're going to go to our fundamentals test, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create a new test here, but just know that you would probably want to make this all in the same test. I'm doing this because I'm going to show you something using the before each command here in a sec. So I'm doing this more for example purposes, but as I mentioned for best practices, you're probably would want to make this in a real world situation, just one longer test rather than writing a bunch of small little unit tests. Cypress recommends that you write a little bit longer test than what I'll be doing here, but we're going to say that the accordion works correctly. So to do this here, we're still going to visit our fundamentals page, but then we're going to want to get our accordion hyphen item hyphen 1. Okay. And we are going to click on that element. And then I just want to pause my test and see where I'm at. So I'm going to then chain on. I'm going to side.click, and then I'm going to call .pause on this. So if I go back to my test runner, you see that I did indeed click on this element. Isn't this cool? This kind of makes testing fun, I think anyways. Okay, testing still isn't that fun, but it's definitely a little more fun here. So I'm going to click on this element, and then you see that this element has the text of your test will exist in a describe block, and then it has some other stuff. So I'm going to copy like the first part of this. And what I'm going to do is, before I click on this element, I'm going to say side.contains, and then I'm going to pass a regular expression in here. And I'm going to paste in your test will exist in the describe block. And I'm going to say that this dot should not be visible. Okay. So I'm going to say your test will exist in the describe block should not be visible. And then I'm going to click on my first accordion item here. And then I'm going to make another assertion. And I'm going to say that this text should be visible. And I'm no longer going to use this pause here. So we're going to go back, we're going to run this, and we do indeed see that this test, it does pass. Because I make an assertion that before I click on this element, I can't see this text, it's not visible. But then after I click on it, it is indeed visible. And now let's also include, if I click on this element again here, so I'm going to copy this, paste it here, I'm going to click on it again. So this should close the element. I'm going to now say that my text should not be visible. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say side.contains this text, and it should no longer be visible. And if I run this here, we actually are going to see it fail here. So what I think is going on is that when it goes to close this, it just clicks on the body of this text. It doesn't actually click on this button up here. So what we actually need to do is we need to adjust this a little bit, in which we want to make sure we're clicking on this div that has a role of button that is actually nested within my accordion item 1. So let's go ahead and copy role equals button here. And I'm going to change my test assertion here. Instead of just getting data-test equals accordion items 1, I'm going to now do, I want to also get within my accordion item 1, I'm going to get my div that has a role of button. And I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to use this assertion down below here as well. Okay. So now if I go back, you see it does open and close it now because I'm clicking on the button. I'm not just clicking on the text. So you have to make sure that you're making the right query for the right thing, which Cypress, it's easy to do because you can just inspect and debug right within how you would with your normal apps there. So that kind of shows you a little bit of the fundamentals here of using describe blocks, using it blocks, how to navigate, getting different elements, clicking on those elements, making your assertions. So with that, let me show you a couple of other fundamentals here in which, well, we could just look at these within my test runner here. So I'm going to close this, but you can also focus on a single test. So if you just want to work on one test at a time, what you can do is you can use it.only to just run a single test. So say I'm working on this second test here. I know this test passed, and I really just want to focus in on the second test and make sure it's working. I can just do it.only. And then when I chain only on, it's only going to run this single test here. And as you can see, my testing suite, it no longer runs my first test. It only runs my accordion works correctly test. And that's one thing to kind of keep in mind as well, is that you're going to see my describe block is right here, my fundamentals test. And then within my describe block, I see the name of all my it blocks. So I'm going to remove it.only. So now I should see my describe block, fundamentals test. I should see contains correct header text as well as accordion works correctly. So if I go back, you see fundamentals test, contains header text, accordion works correctly. Okay. Now with this, within our testing blocks, you can also use a before each command. So like I say, you could use before each to perform certain actions prior to every test. Now this can be helpful when you need to kind of set different things up for your test. So if you want to navigate to a certain page, if you need to use a certain fixture or intercept, which I will cover here a little bit later on, or you need to do other test setup, you should use a before each. Now, Cypress also has an after and after each function, but Cypress recommends using before or before each to set things up beforehand. I'll cover why that is in our best practice section, but they do recommend using before each or before rather than after or after each. And I'll explain why that is here later on. But let's go ahead and use a before each function. And as you can see, right now I'm kind of repeating sci.visit/fundamentals in both of these tests. So why don't I just use a before each function? Into this, I pass a callback function as well. I don't pass a title, just a callback function. And I'm going to use sci.visit fundamentals. I'm going to remove that. And then I don't need sci.visit fundamentals within my individual tests anymore, because I'm going to use my before each here to visit my fundamentals page before both of these tests right here. So if I save that and I go back, you should see both of my tests still correctly pass because I used my before each block to navigate to my fundamentals page before each test. Now, you could use this before each block, like I said, for anything that you need to do to set up your tests. It's very kind of useful for those use cases. Now, the last kind of fundamental I want to show you, and this is by no means the end of the Cypress course. We still got quite a bit to cover here, but I think that once you have these fundamentals down, you can definitely start writing your own tests and start really being a bit more proficient with Cypress. But we, of course, are still going to cover best practices, writing component tests, some examples of common use cases covering forms. And so we still got quite a bit to go here, but this is kind of the last fundamental I want to show you. And that is using custom commands. So you aren't limited to just the sci.whatever commands, but you can create your own custom commands. And you can add these commands to Cypress/support/commands.ts or JS. For example, you might add a custom get data command that gets an element by a data-test attribute. So in our kind of queries here, you see that for all of our sci.gets here, we're doing square brackets, data-test, and then equals fundamentals header. Square bracket, data-test equals accordion item 1. So we're kind of repeating ourselves here, in which we're repeating this data-test pretty frequently. So wouldn't it kind of be nice to like be able to use a sci.get by data-test or sci.get data test? So we can just pass in fundamentals header. And since I had to go a little bit deeper here with this query, we won't actually use it for these. But what if I wanted to replace this one with my own custom command? So then whenever I'm just getting an element by its data test, I could just reuse that command. Well, like I said, we can go to my support in commands.js, and we can write just a single command here by doing something like this. So the way that we can do this is doing cypress.commands.add, and we can name our command here. So I'm going to say get data test, and then all it's going to take is a data test selector, and within the body of this function here, so as you can see, this follows a very similar structure as we've seen before with Cypress, in which we first pass it the title of our custom command here. And then as a secondary argument here, we pass it a callback function that is going to be our actual code. And all we need to do here is we're going to return using the sci.get, and then we're going to pass it in a JavaScript template literal here. And all we're going to do is data-test, and that is equal to our data test selector here. So we're writing a custom command, and to write your own custom command, you use cypress.commands and call the add method. And then we use two arguments. The first argument is going to be the name of your custom command. So it's just a string. We're calling this get data test. And then the second argument is going to be a callback function that is going to be actually your code that you want to be your custom command. So in this example, all I'm going to do is I'm going to return sci.get, and I'm going to hard code in my data-test, and then my kind of dynamic variable here is my data test selector. So when I call sci.get data test, I can pass a data test selector, and then it's going to return sci.get this data test of my test selector. So the way that this works here is if I go back to my fundamentals page, instead of doing sci.get data-test fundamentals header, I can just do sci.get data test, and I can just pass in my fundamentals header here. And then I'm going to say should contain text testing fundamentals, and I'm going to remove this here. So instead of needing to rewrite my data-test every time I just want to get an element by its test ID, I can just use this custom command get data test, pass in my data test ID or my data test string here, and then use my assertion that way. So if I go back to my test runner, you see everything still passes because I wrote my custom command and it works just like it did before. But now instead of needing to write this attribute selector for data-test, I can just use this custom command, and we will continue to use this custom command as we move forward with our tests, and as we do different examples, we'll be able to use this, and you'll see it come in handy more and more here. Okay, so just to kind of go over these fundamentals once again here, with Cypress, you write your tests within a file, a Cypress file, and this file is going to contain a describe block. It takes two arguments. The first argument is going to be a string that is going to be the title of that describe block. And that string is going to show up within your testing suite, right within your kind of spec files here. So if I open this, you see I have fundamentals.sci-.js. That's the name of my file name. And then my describe block has my fundamentals test. So I'm testing my fundamentals page. And then within your describe blocks, you're going to have it blocks. And those are going to be very similar to describe blocks, but they're for your individual tests, which the first argument to your it blocks is going to be a string with a name of that individual test. The second argument is going to be a callback function that actually contains your test code. Okay, so you have your describe blocks and it blocks, and then you also have different commands and interacting with elements, in which Cypress gives you the global sci object in which you can have different methods on it, like sci.click, sci.visit, sci.get, all these different elements to add some different user actions and to help you with your testing. And then you can get elements using sci.get. And then after you get an element, you can use command chaining and make an assertion on those. But for getting your elements, all you need to do is pass a CSS query selector as a string to your sci.get, and that will return that element. And then you can make an assertion on it by doing chaining. So sci.get my h1 element, and it should contain certain text, or it should have a certain property, so on and so forth. And then you can focus on individual tests by using it.only to only run that single test. You can use a before each function to perform certain setup actions before your tests. And you can write this at the very top of your describe block. So before each, and then you can pass in a function for your different code that you want to set up your test. So here we want to visit our fundamentals page before all of our tests here. And then with that, you can also add your own custom commands within your support commands.js using cypress.commands.add. It takes 2 arguments. The first is going to be the name of your command. So whatever you use for your string here, it's going to be the name of your command. So this is going to be sci dot, in this example, get data test. But if I called this just get data, then it would be sci.get data. Okay. And then the second argument is going to be a callback function that is going to be your command code. So here I expect when I call data get data test, that I'm going to pass it a data test selector, and then I'm just going to return sci.get, and then using that data test selector. And then I can use this within all of my different tests. So those are the fundamentals of Cypress, but we still got a little ways to go here. Let's now move to forms, how you can get forms, type into forms, test that we successfully subscribe, testing validation, and all that stuff related to forms. So let's now move on to that. And what we're going to do is head over to the forms page, and we're basically just going to test this email input. Now, it might seem like, super straightforward and stuff, and it is pretty straightforward. But when it comes to forms, there's actually quite a bit of different things that we can do with it, in which we can get the form, we can type in the form, we can click on the subscribe button, we can test whether it was successful or if there's a failure. We can also test a validation. So there's a lot of different things that you can do when it comes to forms. So let's go ahead and write a new test for this form. So heading back to my code editor here, we're going to write another test here, and we're going to go to my Cypress folder, and then within it, we're going to go to my end-to-end folder, and then we're going to create a new file here. So I'm going to create a new file, and it's just going to be forms.sci.js. Okay. And now to write our test here, we're first going to start it with a describe block. And then as a first argument to this describe block, it's going to be the title of our entire testing suite. So I'm going to just say forms test, or maybe form tests makes more sense. And then we're going to pass a callback function here. And then within this callback function, this is where we can kind of set up our test. So we're going to go before each here and pass a callback function into before each. And we're going to use sci.visit. And we're going to visit our forms page. I believe that's the correct URL. And then for my first test, the first argument is going to be a string explaining the test. So I think that we can do this actually all in one test. I don't think we necessarily need to write a bunch of individual tests here. It can just be one longer test that tests this form as like a best practice by Cypress anyways. So we probably wouldn't have needed to use this before each, but just for more practice, kind of getting the syntax down, I think it's fine to do that. And yes, I also changed my shirt. It's a different day. I record these videos before I go to work in the morning. I work a regular 9-to-5 job. So yeah, that's the only reason I don't wear the same shirt every single day. So with that, we're going to test subscribe form. So that's going to be our title of our test. And then we're going to pass a callback function that's actually going to be our test code here. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is probably, well, I think we can first assert that we are on the correct page. So all we need to do here is I'm going to assert that this page contains testing forms as text. So all we have to do that is sci.contains testing forms. And I'm going to pass a regular expression that is case insensitive, and that is going to assert that we do indeed go to the correct page. So I'm going to open up my specs here, and we now see a new test here called forms.sci.js. So I'm going to click on that, and we can see that this runs, and it does indeed pass. So all I do is I visit the forms page, and over here on the left side, you can also see your different assertions So here I can see site.visit/forms, site.contains, testing forms, and it's a regular expression. And it even shows me that it sees testing forms right here in my page. So we see testing forms. And then if I click on this, you can see printed output to the console. So I can also head to my console here, and you can see that it prints out my content of testing forms, and it says it's applied to, and it shows me where in the DOM that is as well. So clicking on this, you can print out what it's finding as your assertion as well, which can be super helpful from time to time. But we asserted that we're on the correct page. So now we want to get this email input and then type something into it. So to do this, let's inspect again. And I think I'm going to want to add a data test attribute to this. So let's go ahead and do that. So back to the code editor, I'm going to go to my forms folder and my page.jsx within that folder. And then here I have my text field that I'm returning within my forms page component. All right. So on this text field, I'm going to add a data test attribute that is going to be subscribe and then going back to my Cypress test runner here, reload this page, and I should see on this input, there should be, or on the wrapper of this input, there should be a data test, and we do see it right here. So we have a data test right here, and then that wraps around our input. So I think that the way that we'll do this is we'll get this data test div here, and then we will find the input within it. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say back to our test here, I'm going to say sci.get, and then I can actually do sci.get data test, I believe is what we used for our custom command. And then I'm going to do subscribe form. And let's just first make sure that that does indeed work and it does get the form. So yes, that does get the form, but now we need to get the input. So I'm going to say .find input. And now let's see if that works. And that does indeed work. So we're getting the input within the form, but now that we've gotten this input, we actually want to type something into it. So let's first just test the happy path, meaning the user goes through and they put the correct email in right away and they successfully subscribe. So let's go ahead and do that here. And all we have to do to type into an input is doing .type. And now I'm going to do a valid email address. So I'm going to just say ryan@coderyan.io, which is actually my email address. So if I go back here and I see that I successfully type into my input ryan@coderyan.io. So now we need to go ahead and click subscribe here. So let's add a data test to this subscribe button. So if I go back and I go to my page.jsx for my subscribe button here and add a data test is equal to subscribe button here. So now we've added this data test. So within our actual test itself, we can go ahead and get our sci.get data test. And here you're kind of seeing how this custom command is coming in quite helpful here. But we're going to get subscribe button. And then all we're going to do with our subscribe button is we're going to click on it. Now we're actually going to get an error here, but I'll show you what's going on. So let's go back and then we click on the subscribe button, but we get invalid email, ryan@ryansolomon.io, because what I'm doing here is within my page.jsx, I'm just adding some validation here just for the sake of example. This isn't how you would actually want to do validation in like a real professional application, as we're just like basically checking two things and outputting just a little bit of text right under the text input here. So this isn't how you would actually want to do this, but one validation I'm doing is if it doesn't include .com, it's going to say invalid email. And also if we don't have an input length, it's going to say that it has a failure message. So let's go ahead and change our typing just a little bit, and let's just put this as .com. This is not my actual email now. This is changed. So if I go and I run this test here by reloading this, you're going to see I subscribe and I get successfully subbed, ryan@coderyan.com. So I'm going to run this again here. I'm going to copy the text quick because I have this message remove after like 3 seconds, I think. So I think I got it copied there. So now I'm going to say that when I click on it, I should be able to see SciDoc contains the text of successfully subbed ryan@coderyan.com. Now, I'm going to want to say that this doesn't exist before I click subscribe. So I'm going to say here, and I'm going to say .should, not .exist. But here, I'm going to say .should exist. So let's go ahead and run this. And we see it's successfully run, but just to see it, it'll run again here live. We see that we do indeed see successfully sub. So that is a bit of the happy path. And if I keep looking down here, it's because I have another dog down here at my feet. It's actually a friend's dog that I'm watching today. So I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just making sure I'm not stepping on the dog down laying on my feet. So with that kind of works. But now let's actually test kind of some failures here. So to do that, we're going to get this input again. And this time around, we're actually going to type in an invalid email and then assert that an invalid email message exists. Now, I'm going to want to get my form again using this assertion. But what we can actually do here, if I'm going to be reusing a certain query a lot or reusing a certain line of code a lot, and it's maybe just in an individual testing suite, I'm not going to be using it kind of like app wide. So like if I was using it app wide, I might add a custom command, like a super general kind of command like get data test. I'm going to use this in a whole bunch of different testing suites throughout the application. But if I'm just using something like an input within a specific test, you could actually create an alias for that and make things a little bit easier on yourself. So let's actually go look here at the Cypress documentation. So this is my localhost 3000, but let's go ahead and look at the docs. And you can actually add aliases. And on this page, it actually covers waiting and retryability as well. So let's cover that as well. So with Cypress, retryability is a core feature of Cypress, and having a proper understanding of it is incredibly important. And I definitely agree with this. So while some other testing tools require you to add hard waits, so like you add an arbitrary wait for like 3 seconds for something to occur, Cypress gives you different ways to kind of do this. So Cypress is notified the moment a page loads and the moment it unloads. It is also notified of any events that are fired. Cypress is smart enough to know how fast an element is animating and will wait for it to stop animating before you do an action upon it. It also automatically waits until an element becomes visible, enabled, or when another element is no longer covering it. Cypress will pause execution of any commands when a page transition happens and waits until a new page loads. So Cypress kind of automatically does, it will automatically retry for an element for a certain amount of time until it exists or an animation is done or something like that. So that is a pretty cool feature of Cypress. I'm not going to go into too much depth of it because it kind of happens automatically, but it is something nice to know. And before we cover aliases, let's also cover explicit wait. So they mentioned that even though Cypress is incredibly smart, not to brag, in handling automatic waiting, there are times when you explicitly want to wait for something. For example, you want to wait for a specific network request to finish. And they mentioned that the best way to kind of do this is if you use a network request, you can give it an alias here, which we'll talk about aliases more in a sec. And then you can just wait for that alias, and it will wait until this network request is done. So instead of just using an arbitrary wait for a certain amount of time, it might be better to give this request an alias, and then using side.wait and passing in that alias name is effectively just going to wait until that request is complete. And that's what Cypress kind of mentions down here. So that would be a little bit better to go about this rather than using arbitrary waits. So like waiting for a certain amount of time. But to go back to aliases here, in Cypress, they use aliases to reference elements, requests, or intercepts across tests. To create an alias, you can use the as function. So here, they get a table, they find the table rows, and then they give it an alias of a rows. So the next time they go to use this, they can just use side.get and then use an @ symbol rows. So they name it rows here, and then you can just use side.get rows. So you don't have to keep typing all this out. You can just get your alias. So that is actually what we're going to do here. We're going to use a type alias for our input because I don't want to have to keep typing this assertion out every time. So I'm going to just go ahead and do this. I'm going to say .as, and I'm going to say subscribe hyphen input. So now instead of using this, I'm going to just say side.get, and then I'm going to use @ symbol subscribe hyphen input. And now this should all still work because I gave this get, this label here, just this alias. So now I can just do side.get @ subscribe input, and then I type into it. So if I go back, I should see that this all indeed does still work here. So now let's go ahead, and after this test completes, this message is going to show for, I believe, 3 seconds. So we actually, I think in this situation, using an arbitrary wait for a certain amount of time is actually something that makes sense here because we want to wait until this message is removed after 3 seconds. So I'm going to actually do side.wait, and we're going to wait for 3 seconds here. And then we're going to say that this message no longer exists after those 3 seconds. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So going back here, and you see it's waiting for 3 seconds, my message is removed, and then I assert that it no longer exists. So that is what we want. So now let's start testing an unhappy path. So we're going to use our alias again here. I'm going to paste it right here. And instead of typing Ryan@coderyan.com, let's do .io. And now we can click on the subscribe button again after this, and we should get some sort of like failure message. So we wait for 3 seconds, and then we get invalid email, Ryan@coderyan.io. So let's actually make an assertion now that invalid email exists after we hit click. So invalid email, Ryan@coderyan.io, that should exist. Waiting for 3 seconds, and then we do indeed get invalid email, Ryan@coderyan should exist. And just to make sure, we're going to make sure that it doesn't exist before we hit click as well. But I trust that this is going to work here. So we're okay to do this. And yes, I'm petting my dog as we're going here. But what we can now do is, so we did the not exist. Let's go look at the code here. So I have successfully subbed. We tested the invalid email here. So now let's test this failure clause. So this basically occurs if I don't put an email in my input at all and I click subscribe. And just like we did before here, I'm going to wait for 3 seconds. And then we're going to say that this no longer exists. And then we're going to get our input here again. but we're actually not going to type anything into it. So we actually don't need to get this input at all. We can actually just click on our subscribe button with nothing in our input. So let's go ahead and do that and let's see what we get. So successfully subscribed, invalid email here. And then we get invalid email, explanation point. So the way that our logic is here is if it doesn't include .com, it's automatically going to just show this message here. So I think that the way that we can solve this is we can actually just put if we have an input value and we have our, and it doesn't include .com here, then it's going to show this message. But if we just don't have an input value, then it should show fail. And this is just JavaScript here. We're just using, okay, if there is an input value and it doesn't include .com, show this message. But technically here, if it doesn't have an input value, then it should just show fail here. So if I go back here and I rerun it, we should see fail for our final test. And then wait for 3 seconds, remove it, and then we do indeed see fail. So let's go assert that fail exists after this test. So we're going to contain this, and then all this should say is fail. But then before this, I want to make sure that fail doesn't exist to make sure that this is working properly. So let's go back, and all this should now work. And as you can see with forms, there actually is quite a bit that you can test when it comes to validation and stuff like that. So everything passes here, and we kind of successfully tested our validation, subscribing, typing in the form, getting the form, and all that stuff. So hopefully that was a good example for you to kind of learn how to use aliases, as well as some different assertions like finding the input and more practice using before each and testing that things exist or should not exist. So I hope that that was a good example for you to learn a lot there. But now let's go ahead and move forward into some more examples in which we're going to touch on multi-page testing, intercepts, helpful message, and we also are going to test a grudge list because, you know, like a to-do list is way too boring. So we are going to have a grudge list in which we're going to add some grudges. And for example, we're going to add a grudge like some guy cut me off on my drive today. And then I'm going to add this grudge. And then you can see I have this grudge. Now, I did add an ability to remove grudges. Normally, we like to hold our grudges and we don't remove them. But for the sake of testing, we are going to remove this. So this will also be kind of a fun example for us to test. So without further ado, let's move on to this examples page. And we're going to start with multi-page testing. So let's go ahead and open our end-to-end folder here and add another file. And what this is going to be is examples.sci.js. And we're going to write a describe block here in which we are going to test our various examples. And here we're going to pass a callback function, and our first it block is going to be multi-page testing. And what we're going to do here is pass another callback function, and we are just going to sci.visit our base URL here. So right there. And I'm then going to pause the test here and see the state of our test. So if I go back and I open my examples file within our Cypress test runner, you should see that it does just go to our homepage and it stays here. And I'm going to navigate here to our examples page. And our first example is multi-page testing. So you can quite easily write tests across different pages to better test your entire user workflows. You can do this by clicking on different buttons. So I can click on my navigation buttons here within my tests to navigate to different pages, but I can also use sci.visit and kind of navigate my application that way, which you've already seen me use site.visit and use that for different navigation within my app. Now, when doing these multi-page tests, one thing that you can do is also make an assertion that you are at the correct path. So you can use site.location, pass in the path name, so it returns the path name, and then you could use an assertion on that. So should equal, and then some path. So let's actually go ahead and do this, and let's actually test our kind of navigation bar up here. Click on these different buttons and assert that we are at the correct location for these tests. So I don't think that I have a data test on any of these buttons here so far. So yeah, I do not have a data test on these. So let's go back to our application code here, and let's go to our components here, and then go to our nav bar. So you can see I have all of my nav items here, and then this is just a React thing. So I map over all of my items, and then I return a new nav item element for every item. And this nav item element is just a link with an href set onto it. So what I should do here is for every item, I should add a data test attribute to it. So up here, I'm going to do data test, and then I'm going to do nav, and then y Cypress. And then I'm going to copy this. And actually, instead of data hyphen test, I'm going to just do data camel case test. And then I'm going to paste this down here, but I'm going to call this overview. And I think you probably see where I'm going with this. I'm going to do this again and do fundamentals here. And then I'm going to do this again. Sorry that this is a little bit tedious, but sometimes this is the nature of writing tests, which is also why, I don't always love writing tests, and I tend to prefer just developing new features. But sometimes coding does have some tedious things that you just have to get done. So one more here, data test, and this is going to be best practices. So then I need to pass those to my nav item element. So I'm going to put these on a new line here just because I'm passing a few different props. And all I'm going to do is say data test is equal to item.data test. And then I'm going to go to my nav item. I'm going to destructure my data test attribute. And on my link component here, I'm going to say data test is equal to data test. So now if I go back to my Cypress runner and I didn't mess anything up, you should see that now these all have a different data test element on them, as you can see here. So now that that is true, within my actual test, we need to get these elements, click on them, and then assert that we are at the correct location within our application. So the way that we can do this here is I can copy this right here to my test here. So examples.sci-spec. And I actually don't want to do Y Cypress first because I'm already at my homepage, but maybe let's actually do this. In my before each block, I'm going to navigate to my examples page first. So I'm going to use a before each, and we're first going to site.visit examples / examples. And then on this test right here, I'm going to actually do site.get data test. And I'm going to pass in my nav.yCypress. And then I'm going to click on it. And then I'm going to use that assertion of this assertion here. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it. So I'm going to do site.location, pass in path name should equal. And then I'm going to do, it should just be my home path here. So I'm going to save this. And it does indeed pass. So you can see I clicked on this nav element here, and then it navigated me to my home page here. So now I just need to do this for all of my other components here. So this one's going to be overview, fundamentals, forms, examples, component, etc. So let's go ahead and I'm going to copy this. We're going to do nav hyphen overview, and then we're going to assert that we are on the overview page. And then we are going to do, let's do fundamentals and assert that we are at the fundamentals page. And you guys probably get the gist. I probably don't need to do this for every single page. If you want to, you can, but the purpose of this is just to show you how multi-page testing can work here and how you can navigate across pages and assert that you are at the correct page. So we'll do overview, fundamentals, examples, why Cypress, and make these assertions using the path name. And then I just refresh the page. You should indeed see that this multi-page test does indeed work here. So with that, that is how you can kind of set up multi-page testing. Pretty straightforward to do. But now let's look at using intercepts in Cypress. So Cypress provides you different ways of working with a network request. And one of those is by using intercepts. So you can effectively intercept a network request that occurs in your application. And then you can return some like example data and something like this. So this could be helpful in a situation to where, like, if you use an external library, like, I don't know, Amazon Cognito services for authentication or something like that, and you want to just like mock that request and you want to intercept it so you're not constantly hitting like AWS during your tests and stuff, then you can use an intercept to do this. So let's go ahead and go to our application code here. And within this application code, we are going to look at our examples page here. And you can see that I have this post button here. And you can see that in my tests, I have this post button here in my examples page. And all this is going to do, if we navigate to it, is make a fetch request to localhost 3000 / examples. And it's going to be a host method, and then it's going to console log. It's actually going to just console log the response. I'm gonna actually change this here. I probably should have done this off the bat, but we're actually going to do res.json, and that then we're going to get the data, and then we'll console log the data here. So we're going to make a post request to this, but in my tests, I don't want to actually make this post request to my database and like store stuff in my database. I just want to intercept this post request and then return some whatever data I decide to return. What we're going to do here is add another it block, and we're going to do intercepts as the title. And then we're going to pass a callback function. And what we're going to do here is we're going to use a sci.intercept function from Cypress. So the first argument to this function is the method that you're going to intercept. So get, post, put, delete, patch. What method are you going to intercept? So in our case, we're going to intercept a post request right now. And the next argument is the URL that we're going to intercept. So in my nav or my post button here, I'm going to copy this URL here. And this is going to be the URL that we are going to intercept. So localhost 3000 / examples. And then the third argument is what we actually want to use as our response here. So for now, I'm just going to say in the body of my response, I'm going to return an object in which I'm going to say the message is successfully intercepted request. Okay. So just to be fully clear here, this post button, when we click on it, this post button is right here. When we click on it, it's going to make a request to this localhost 3000 examples. And then I am going to, within my test, I'm going to intercept that post request here using sci.intercept with a post method at this URL. And then I'm going to return a response that has a body containing a message saying successfully intercepted request. And we should see that within my console here because I'm console logging my response data. So we're going to go back here and I'm just going to run my intercepts test here. So I'm going to do it.only and we're going to focus on this intercept. So now that we have this intercept in place, what we need to do is click on our button. So let's add a data test to this button. And I'm going to say post button is all I'm going to name it. So in our test here, what we need to do is we need to sci.get data test. And hopefully you're seeing that we're using this data test all the time, which is why it's so useful to have this as a Cypress command. But we're going to get the post button and all we're going to do is click on that button. And within my test here, you see it run successfully. And then just so I can have a cleaner console, I'm going to just click post button again. But what you can see is when I hit this button and I post data, I return a message of successfully intercepted request. So our intercept is working correctly. Now, what if in your intercepts, you want to actually, instead of just returning some hard-coded message, you want to return like some data from a file? Well, the way that you can do this is using a fixture. So let's actually look at the docs here, the Cypress docs on intercepts. So just like what I explained to you here a little bit below, you can use the sci.intercept method. You can pass in the method you're intercepting as well as the URL name. And then you can also give it an alias like it's doing here. So they're intercepting this and they're calling that the as intercept here. And then you can use just like we talked about with waits earlier, you could use a wait for this request to finish. So if you want to intercept a sign up request and you just want to mock that, and you don't want the rest of your test to continue running until that sign up is complete or that request has resolved, you could just use sci.wait, pass in your alias for your intercept there, and it will wait until this request occurs, which can be super useful to do. Now, here below, let's go down and show their example of fixtures. So here, they intercept a GET request and they return a fixture of public transactions.json. So they just return this fixture file. And the way that you can do this is you can add a fixture file to your fixtures folder that Cypress automatically created for us already. But before I get to that, I just want to touch on a couple more things on this page. So within your intercepts, if you want to modify the headers from a response, you can do that just like they're doing here. So earlier, my third argument to my intercept, I passed a body and I made the body this right here, message successfully intercepted request. But you could also adjust the headers. So pass a headers property and adjust those there. And you can modify the response data just like it's doing here, very similar to kind of what I did earlier. And then you can also inspect the request and you can add more kind of a logic within it. So if the body of the request contains a certain property, you can reassign it to something else. You can assign it to something else. So you can add a lot of logic in your intercepts just like it's doing here. But generally speaking, it works very similarly to how we kind of did it here. And I would say if you are trying to figure something out with your intercepts, you can probably do it. I would just come to your docs and consult them here. But let's go back to the fixtures and look a little bit closer on how this works. So back to our code editor here, you can see that Cypress automatically adds a fixtures folder for us. So within our Cypress folder, we also have a fixtures folder. And within that folder, that's where we can add different fixture files. And fixture files are typically files of like mock data that you can use within your tests. So we have within our fixtures an example.json file. And this is just a JSON file that has a name, email, and body property, with just some example data within it. So within my Cypress test here, what if I want to return this fixture? Well, instead of returning body as a property here, I can actually return a property called fixture, and then I can just return example.json. So now if I go back here and I'm going to clear my console and I'm going to click post data, you can see that my data And now is my fixture. So my body is fixtures are great mock data for responses, just like I talked about earlier. And then it has the email and the name that it has also in my example.json fixture file. So if you want to return some mock data and you want to kind of intercept a request and return that, you can just set a property called fixture and point that to your file within your fixtures folder. So I could have another file within this fixtures folder called response.json or example response.json. And all I would do if I wanted to return that is set a fixture property to example response.json. And as long as I add that within my fixtures folder here, Cypress automatically knows what I'm trying to do here. Okay. So that is how you can use fixtures and intercepts within your tests to kind of mock some data, mock some different requests and responses and things like that. So, we're not really doing many like assertions in this test. This is really just to show you how you can do intercepts, use them alongside fixtures and that sort of thing within your programs. Okay. So those are super useful. Use them all the time in a kind of real world application, which you just creating like kind of a demo application like this, you don't see this as much. But if you have an application where you're making several API calls to different providers and stuff like that, you're probably going to be using intercepts and returning fixture files within your test. It can be a little bit tricky when you're first seeing it, but it is really straightforward. All I'm doing is using sci.intercept to intercept a request. It could be a post, get, put, patch, and then you pass in the URL and you just need to match the URL of that request. And then you can return whatever you want as a response. And then you can also manipulate the headers, or you can modify the response data like this using request.continue and then adjusting it this way. Or you can use other conditionals within this kind of third argument here to the intercept that you use. Okay. And then you can also use fixture files by just adding a fixture file within your fixture folder that Cypress automatically gives you already. And then you can just set a property of fixture to whatever your file name is within your fixtures folder. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of fixtures. But our next example here is, and this is really just going to be going over this part of their documentation in which they talk about some helpful methods, as I don't think it's particularly useful for you to learn every single method that exists within Cypress. Like that would not be a productive use of your time. However, there are a handful of methods that I do think are good for you to know that they exist and that they're available to you, that you can use, and that I often use them a lot in my own test writing. All right. So let's actually go to this page in their docs here, in which we go to Cypress methods that you need to know. So the first one is the .its method. So this is a very kind of handy method in which, say you have like a array that you get from your DOM. So you get an array and this array has these kind of two names. You can use the .its method to get the kind of first index of that array. So they have this array here, and then they're asserting that the element at the first index of this array, so with zero-based indexing, that would be this string here that is yu, and they're saying that should equal yu. But you can also use it, like this is pretty useful, but it's even more useful when you use it with properties. So here, you can see they have an object with an age of 52. So if they get an element with an age of 52 from the DOM, they can say .its age. So of this object, get the property that has an age, and then that should equal 52, which if you have like a kind of more complex object and you want to get the property from it, this can be super useful here. And then additionally to that, you can also get kind of nested responses. So here it's getting the response from this public transactions request, and then it's saying, okay, .its response.body.results. So it's going nested in here. It's getting the response property on this public transactions response here, and it's going into the body, and then it's getting the results property on it. So you can use the its method to access different properties or different indexes of an array within your kind of elements that you return from like a sci.get or a response like they're doing in this example here. Okay, so the its method can be super useful here, but you can also use the invoke method. So this allows you to invoke a function on a previously yielded subject. At the end of the day, Cypress is just JavaScript, and the sci.invoke method allows you to call JavaScript functions on JavaScript data types. So an example of what this looks like is if they get this response that has response.body.results, and that is a array, well, they can .invoke the slice method on that array, and then they can pass in the arguments of 0 and 5. So just like in JavaScript, if you want to use the slice method on an array and you want to slice from the 0th index to the 5th index, well, you can do that in Cypress by, if you yield an array within Cypress. So here they're using the .its method that we just covered, and they are yielding the response.body.results that is an array. Well, they can then invoke the slice method on that array by calling .invoke here, and they pass in the arguments of 0 and 5. And this will invoke the slice method with the arguments of 0 and 5. So you can use the invoke method to invoke different JavaScript functions that you return on your yielded subjects within Cypress. Also, a very useful thing that you can do here, and hopefully this example is clear on how you can do that. Now, alongside that, you can also make HTTP requests in Cypress using the request method. Now, I personally don't use this a ton in the tests that I write, but every once in a while, this does come in handy. So request is a helpful method anytime you need to make an HTTP request within your test and perform expectations against it. So here you can see they use sci.request. They use a post method, and then they post to this URL, and then they pass in an object with some different data on it. So you can use the request method in Cypress to make different requests within your test. This actually is a pretty similar API as like a fetch method, in which you could do, in JavaScript, you could do fetch a certain URL, and then you can pass in an options object. It's a little bit similar to this, except for it works a little bit more similar to Cypress Intercepts, in which the first argument is the method, so get, post, put, delete, and then the second argument is the URL you want to make that request to, and then you can add some different options to it like that. So definitely something that is useful to know here on how to make different requests within your Cypress tests using sci.request. Then the final one we'll look at here is the .within method. So this scopes all subsequent Cypress commands to within an element. So say you're using a form, and then you just want to kind of like drill down into its child elements. You can use within to limit the scope of Cypress commands to within a specific element. So here they get this element here, and they say within that element, you should have a lessons complete of 0, or an element that has a lessons complete -0. So I think give a potentially better example is, say you get a form within your web page and you want to get certain inputs within that form, but you don't want to make your queries to elements that are outside of that form. Like you don't want to accidentally be getting an input that is maybe in your nav bar, and maybe it's a search input within your nav bar, but you also have a search input within your form, and you just want to get the one within your form. Well, you could use this .within method to only focus your queries or your Cypress commands on the element within your form. And this can be helpful for if you're running into a Cypress error that says, it'll say something along the lines of, you cannot make this assertion on multiple elements. You only expected one element. Often this occurs when you're trying to make a Cypress command on elements that you didn't think you were trying to make that command on. And that's often done because you're not limiting the scope of that command. And if you use this dot within, you might be able to use this to make sure that you're not running into that error and you're only making these assertions or these commands on elements within other elements. So if you're finding yourself needing to drill down into the children of an element, you could use the dot within method to kind of scope your tests a little bit better there. But with that, let's now move to an additional example here of our grudge list. So let's actually just kind of go and test our grudge list here, which we have right here. So we have a grudge list in which we could add grudges and then we can remove them. So I'm going to close my inspector there, and then I'm just going to say some grudge, and then I'm going to add a grudge, and you can see it gets added. I've add grudge, and then I can remove it, and you can see the text changes and stuff like that. So let's actually start writing some tests for this, just to test some kind of different states within Cypress and to test some different state changes. So let's go back to our examples test, and then I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it dot only again, and then I'm going to name this just grudges, and then we are going to write our test. So we should already be at the example page, and when we get to our example page here, I'm going to just side out pause here for a sec. Let's go back. So this, when we don't have any grudges down here, it should say add some grudges. So let's now assert that side dot contains, and then we're going to do add some grudges here. And then we'll make sure that this works. So we're basically asserting that before we have any grudges, we have add some grudges. So let's now inspect this. And so it's an input, and it doesn't really have like a great way to select this. So let's add a data test to this grudge input here. So within my components, I have a grudge list, and here's my text field here. And let's go ahead and add a data hyphen test, and that's going to equal my grudge list. Actually, it's more of just like a grudge input is better to call that. So now if I open this up a little bit more, I should see that I have my grudge input on this div right here, but I want to make sure to select my input here. So what I can actually do here is let's use side dot within to select this input. So I'm going to do within my Cypress test, I'm going to say side get data test, and I named it grudge. I think I named it grudge input. I'm going to say dot within. I'm going to call this, and I'm going to pass a function to it. And then I'm going to say side dot, just a regular side dot get, and then I'm going to get an input. And then I'm going to type in that input some grudge. So let's see if that works here. And you can see it does. So this is an example of I get my overall grudge like text field here. So if I inspect this here, I get my overall grudge text field here, but I want to get the input within my grudge text field. So I don't want to concern myself with all other inputs that might occur on this page. In this example, there are no other inputs that occur on this page, but say there were, and I didn't want to concern myself with those, I can use the side out within and just pass in an input, and I'm only concerning myself with the inputs within my grudge input here. So hopefully that shows a good example of how that kind of helpful method works there. But now that we have this, we need to definitely add our grudge here. So here I have my add grudge button, and it also doesn't have a great way to query it. So let's go ahead and add a data test to my add grudge button, which exists right here. So I'm going to do data hyphen test equals add grudge button. And am I spelling grudge correctly in all these? I sure hope I am. I'm actually not too sure. But below our previous get data test, we're going to do side.get data test, and it's going to be my add grudge button, and then I'm going to .click on that button here. So you can see I have now called my click method on my add grudge button, and I've indeed added some grudge here. So let's see here. I have a UL that has my list item in here. So I think the best way to do this is to actually say that my UL here contains one list item after I add my grudge. So let's go ahead and go back to my grudge list. And so I'm always rendering this unordered list here, but then I'm mapping over all of my grudges and rendering them as a list item. So let's add a data test here, which is equal to, and this one I will actually call my grudge hyphen list, like so. I'm going to go back to my test, and I'm going to say, before I click on my add button, and really before I type anything in, I'm going to say side.get data test, and I'm going to get my grudge list, and then I'm going to call my .within method, and then within my grudge list, I'm going to use side.get, and then I'm going to get all of my list items, and then I'm going to say .should have length of 0. So I should not have any items within my grudge list when I first start this test, but after I click down here, then it should have a length of 1 because I should have added one list item. So let's save this and see if this works here. And it does. So you can see within my kind of history here, when I just rendered this page, I see my list items, I have 0. But then after I add a grudge here, my list items, it now has 1. So let's do the same thing. And when I add another grudge, my list items should now have 2 here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to copy this here, and you could add this as like a custom command and have it be like add to grudge list or something like that. But we already showed you custom command, so we're not going to do that here. But let's get our grudge input again. And then I'm going to say that instead of some grudge, I'm going to say that this one is number 2. I don't know. And then we're going to click the add button, and then we're going to use side.get data test. And this time we're going to say that it now has length of 2. Let's copy this and paste it below. So I'm going to do shift option down arrow, and that's going to duplicate this into another line here. I'm going to get my LIs again, but here, let's actually use the its method, and let's get our first list item. So the 0th index, and I'm going to say should have text, and that text should be some grudge. So let's go ahead and see if that works here. And you see that I put a typo in here because it says expected LI to have text some grudge, but the text was some grudge X. So it's actually not a typo here. So the way that I render this out within my grudge list is for every list item, I actually render out a span that has my text, and then I render out a button that has X next to it. So I think a better way to actually do this is instead of have text, let's do contains text. I think that will actually work here, and it does. So as you can see here, I now have both of my grudges that have been added, and within our tests, we are using the .within method here, so showing you that helpful method. And then we're also using the its method to get the 0th element of my list items, saying it has the text of some grudge. So now let's go ahead and we should click on the X element of one of our grudges, and then we should assert that my list actually now has a length of 1. And then we should click the clear button and assert that it has a length of 0. So it clears them all out. So to do this, let's use the inspector here. And is there a good way that I can query for this X? So I actually think that we can. So what I'm going to do here is within this list item here, this is just a button. So I think we can use the within method here again. I'm going to copy this here, paste it below. I'm going to get my grudge list, and then I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to get my first list item here. So I'm going to use the .its, and I'm going to get my first list item, and then I think I can say .within again, and then within my first list item, I should be able to sci.get my button, and then I should click on that button because that should remove this particular list item. And then I'm going to copy this and paste it below. Now that I remove that list item, it then should have a length of 1. My elements, I'm going to remove that secondary one. So let's go ahead and run this. And you see it does indeed pass. I'm going to just run it again just to make sure. So you can see I removed that first grudge and it still works. So what I did here is I got my grudge list here. And then within my overall UL grudge list, I got all of my list items. I got my first list item using the .its method and passing in a 0. So the list item at the 0th index, because this sci.get will return an array of all of my list items. And then within that first list item, using the .within method, I get my button and I just click on it. And that button is going to be my X element to remove that particular list item. And then I then assert that my list has shrunk down to 1. Now let's just click the clear button and assert that we have cleared all of our items. So okay, so this is interesting here, in which I'm only rendering my clear button after my grudge list is over 0. So I have a grudge. So let's do a data-test is equal to clear button. And I'm going to move this to another line here, just so you can see it a little bit better. And this looks ugly. Normally, I would have Prettier installed and it would do this for me automatically. Definitely recommend using Prettier. But what I'm going to do here is within my test, at the top of my test, before I have any grudges, I'm going to also do sci.get data test. I'm going to say clear button that should not exist. So I'm going to say that it doesn't exist when I start my test and my grudge list has a length of 0. But then here at the end of my test, I'm going to say sci.get data test, and I'm going to say clear button, and then I'm going to click on that button. And I don't need to remake an assertion here saying it exists, because just trying to click on this button, it's going to have to exist. So I'm implicitly saying that it exists here by trying to click on it. So I'm not kind of being redundant with my assertions there. And then I'm going to get my grudge list here again. And all I'm going to do is say it has a length of 0 now after I've cleared my list. And if I run this, everything does indeed pass here. So I think that pretty well tests our kind of grudge list here. I think that actually, let me check one more thing. I'm going to add some grudge here again. And it does change the text here to grudges. So what we can do is we can also test this here quickly. So let's go back here and go to our grudge list. This will be the last thing we test here, in which I do data-test is equal to grudge list title. And then what we're going to do is this, you can see that this title here, if my grudges is greater than 0, my title is going to be grudges, else it's going to be add some grudges. So to test this logic here, I'm going to do at the top of this, once again, I'm going to do site.get data test, and I'm going to do grudge list title, and I'm going to say .should, and I'm going to say have text of, I think it's just add some grudges. And then here, after I've added a single grudge here, so right here, I know that my grudges has a length of 1. I'm going to just assert that this title now says grudges, just to test and make sure that that logic is working correctly. And you do indeed see that it passes here. So with that, that has tested our grudge item component. I'm sure there's other things that you could do here for this, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of how you can kind of use some of those helpful methods that we went over here in example 3, and how you can use intercepts, multi-page testing, and different things like that. But we aren't quite done here, as now we still need to cover our component tests, how you can write those, and then we will move on to some different best practices. Now, to transition into component testing here, what we're going to do is I'm going to actually head back to my code editor here. And this terminal is where I ran the command of npx Cypress open. And I was checking to see if Ragnar knocked my light over there. He's blocking it a little bit, but oh well. So this is the terminal to where I ran npx Cypress open. I'm actually going to kill this terminal with Control C. And then you can see I killed this process here. And let me clear this so you can see I have it right here. And then I'm going to reopen Cypress. So I'm going to do npx Cypress open here again. And this time around, we're actually going to go component testing. And just like with end-to-end testing, this is automatically going to configure our project for component testing. So I'm going to click this, and it detected that I'm using Next.js. So I'm just going to go next step. And then it says you've successfully installed all required dependencies. And then I'm just going to click continue here. And then you can see it's going to add all these different files within our project. So we're going to just go ahead and click continue here. So it's initializing everything, and we're going to start component testing here in Chrome. And it sees that we don't have a component test here. So I'm going to do create new spec. And then we're going to test our accordion component. So that is the component in which, for my course notes, if I click on one of my notes and it opens it up, it shows like my notes for that. And then we click on it again, it closes it. We're going to write a component test for that. So I think the spelling on this is like so, accordion. And I'm going to create that spec. And we'll do okay, run spec. So here, let's go back to our project and see what we've done here. So if I close this, and then we go to our Cypress folder here, you can see that I now have a folder within my Cypress folder called component. And that is where my component tests are going to be. And I'm going to close my terminal here. So this is going to be where my component tests are. So I'm going to click on my accordion.sci.jsx. This is what Cypress just added here, was this component folder, as well as we created this component test file. And if I wanted to write more component tests, I would just add another file within this component folder, and it would be the name of my component and then .sci.jsx is how I would write more component tests. But we open this file, we see, luckily in Cypress, component tests very similar to end-to-end tests. So there's actually not much new stuff that we need to know here. We still have our describe blocks and our end-to-end tests. We still have our it blocks that work the same way as well. So really not a ton else to learn here. And we also use the same kind of assertions that we do in end-to-end testing and different things like that. But there are a couple of things regarding these component tests that are useful to know. So let's actually head back to our project here at localhost 3000. I'm going to close this Cypress runner. And let's go over to component here, and I'm going to open up the first note here. So as I kind of alluded to, Cypress also allows you to test individual components in your app via component testing. Now, why would you do this? Well, Cypress component testing uses the same test runner commands and APIs. So like I said, there's not a bunch of new stuff that we're going to have to learn here to start writing component tests. However, the main difference is that Cypress component testing builds your components using a development server instead of rendering within a complete website, which results in faster tests and fewer dependencies on infrastructure than end-to-end tests covering the same code paths. So that might sound like a lot. That is basically just saying that, hey, when you write a component test, you are just testing that component test. You don't have to worry about like logging into your application or having some sort of authentication, or you don't have to like go down this login and navigation and go through this code path just to get to a certain component. And maybe you have a component that you want to test that is only available to you when you're creating a new account with your overall application, but you don't want your end-to-end test to be creating new accounts all the time. So maybe you write a component test. So there are use cases when component tests are very useful. And for these component tests, they're useful for when you don't want to go down an entire code path. You don't want to have any dependencies on your infrastructure or logging in or authentication, and you just want to write a test for a component in isolation. That's when you'd use a component test. And like I said, the API for these is very similar to end-to-end tests. Our assertions are similar. We use describe blocks, if blocks, stuff like that. Now, for additional configuration here, depending on your project, you may have to add more configuration to your kind of Cypress config. But luckily, Cypress usually does this automatically for you, but sometimes you have to add additional configuration. So if we go back here and we go to our Cypress config.js, you can see I now, within my defined config here that I'm exporting from this file, Cypress has now added a component property here, and it's setting a dev server property within my component object, and it's setting the framework as Next and the bundler as Webpack. So within Next.js, you have to do something like this to your config to start writing component tests. Now, this can change depending on whether you're using Angular, Vue, vanilla JavaScript, something like that. So you might have to do some configuration manually on your own, but Cypress is pretty good about detecting that sort of thing and adding this for you, because here it just added it for us here. All right, but just keep in mind that this config file, this is where you can add other configuration things, which can be helpful. I know that in our professional application, we do use some code in this setup node events to use some different tasks and stuff like that, but that's a little bit more advanced than what we're gonna kind of get into today. But if I go back here, you might have to do some additional configuration, like I said. And then also within your component tests, I would say maybe one of the biggest like just syntax differences is that instead of like initially visiting a page and then navigating around your application, you're actually just going to mount a component using sci.mount, and then you can just interact and make assertions just as you would with an end-to-end test. So like I say here, let's go test our accordion. So I'm going to go back here, and if I go to my accordion.sci.jsx, you can see that Cypress has already added this sci.mount. So what I'm going to do here is I have a component called accordion right here. So we're going to mount this accordion with some different items and make some assertions for it. So if I go back to and I actually call it items accordion. So I'm going to uncomment this, and I'm going to render my items accordion and automatically import that from my components folder, and then close that there. But I do need to pass an items array here, in which, and I need to put that in curly braces here, but I'm going to go to, I think, my fundamentals page maybe, and I'm going to grab some items here. So I'm going to just copy this items array, go back to my accordion, and then above my test, I'm going to set these items. I don't think we need to have 8 of them. Let's maybe just do 3 of them. And then I'm going to set my items prop here to my items. So I'm just mounting this, and I'm going to say that this is my items accordion. And then I'm going to go back here, and you can see that within my Cypress runner, it now mounts my items accordion here, in which I have my 3 kind of fundamentals here. And now I can write component tests for this without needing to worry about signing into my application, authentication, and stuff like that. I can just test and make sure that my accordion, just this component, is working correctly by mounting it to my page here, just rendering it to my page, and then making some different assertions. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I inspect this here, let's see what makes sense to kind of go about testing. But I think I want to assert that I have 3 items here. So I think I want to, let me go to my items accordion. And for this wrapper div, I'm going to give it a data test here. And I'm going to do data test is equal to accordion hyphen wrapper. So now in my overall test, and I'm going to go back to my accordion side.jsx, but in my test now, it should wrap my items in a accordion wrapper div. So we see this accordion wrapper, and then within that, I have 3 divs that are my accordion items. So what I can do here is I can make our first assertion here just like I kind of normally would, to where I can do sci get data test. So I can still use my custom Cypress commands within my component test here, and I can do accordion wrapper, and then I'm going to say dot within, just like we've done before. And then within this accordion wrapper, I need to get all of my divs that start with a data test. So they should have a prefixed accordion item and then some ID. So the way that I want to do this is I'm going to do sci.get, and then I need to get a data test, and I think it's going to be up arrow equal sign and then accordion item. So this is saying get all elements that start with accordion item as a data test, which should be able to select my 3 items. And I believe I should be able to just do should have a length of 3 here. So if I go back to this, it does look like it ran successfully. So if I run it again, it does indeed work. So I'm asserting that it has 3 items. And now I think all we need to do here additionally is maybe get the first accordion item. So accordion item 1 here, and then we can open it, assert that it has its expected tests, and then close it and assert that that doesn't exist, just kind of how we did before. And let me actually, we'll go ahead and write this. So let's do sci.get data test, and then we'll get accordion item 1, and we'll say dot click. So that should open it. And before we do that, we should first say that your test will exist in the describe block. We should say that that is not visible. So we'll do sci.contains your test will exist in the describe block that should not dot be dot visible. But then after we click it, it should be visible. So we'll remove not there, and then we'll click it again, and then we'll assert that it's not visible again, just to kind of test that our accordion opens and closes as expected. And we did the same thing that we did earlier. So I need to make sure that I am clicking on my button within my accordion item and not just my paragraph text. We did this exact same thing earlier. So I'm going to get that item, then I'm going to do dot within, and then I'm going to say sci.get my button, and it's actually not a button here. It's a div with a role equals button. So we need to do a attribute role is equal to button here. And I believe that this should work. And then if we copy this and paste it here, I believe this will now pass, and it does indeed pass. So here you can see that to write component tests within Cypress, all you need to do is run the Cypress npx Cypress open, click configure component tests, and then it will automatically add this component folder as well as some configuration to your Cypress config.js. And then within your component folder, all you need to add is a file that is .sci.jsx or tsx if you're using TypeScript. And then you can write your describe and it blocks just like you normally would, but you can use sci.mount to mount whatever component you want to test, and then write your assertions just like we've been doing this whole time. So most stuff with component tests really doesn't change. You still use your describe and it blocks and normal assertions that you've learned throughout this course, but all that's different is you mount your individual component, and then you don't have to worry about logging in, authentication, and different things like that. And of course, you add them within your component folder that Cypress will create for you. All right, so really, I think that covers component tests. I don't think there's much else we need to spend time with here, considering it is so similar to end-to-end tests that you've already learned there. All right, so next up here, and the final section for us to cover is actually just going through some different best practices here. So the first one that I want to talk about, and all these best practices are recommended from Cypress. This is not necessarily just me with my experience, although I do agree with these best practices after using Cypress for the last few years. So number one is making sure to test unhappy paths. So don't just test the happy path of the user. Make sure to test how the user might maliciously use your application or just unexpected paths that they go down. Like if you've been programming, sometimes the user will do some things that you definitely do not expect. So if you have a certain input that you are writing tests for, don't just test that they perfectly type their email in correctly. Make sure to test that they, forget to put a .com on the end of their email, that they don't use enough characters, that they put a phone number in for their email, that they try to write a scripting command in your email. Try to test all these different things and really try to consider the non-happy paths. And this is also true when you're developing new features. You want to make sure that after you add a new feature, you don't just test that it works with the happy path. Really try to break that feature and really try to find different bugs, okay? So when testing, make sure to test the unhappy paths as well as the happy paths. Also, Cypress recommends using stable selectors. So we talked about this a little bit before, and we've been doing this throughout this entire course, but using data attributes to provide context to your selectors and isolate them from CSS or JavaScript changes is what Cypress recommends. So don't target elements based on CSS attributes such as IDs, classes, or tags, and don't target elements that may change their text content. And also don't use too generic of selectors. So just using sci.get button and selecting all of your buttons within your entire application, probably not a good idea. However, maybe you use sci.get a certain data test selector, and then within that, you get the button like we've done throughout this course. I think that's much more reasonable because you're still scoping that selector. It's not too generic. And then also don't couple your selectors to styles. So effectively what it's saying here is that to prevent yourself from just having flaky tests and for your tests breaking because of reasons that aren't related to actually undesirable behavior, make sure to use stable selectors, which in a lot of cases, it's going to be those data test attributes that we've been adding this entire time. And, making sure to have these in isolation from CSS and JavaScript changes, as you don't necessarily just want your test to fail because a CSS class changed its name. Like, I know we made the mistake before in our professional application in which we would use Material UI components, and Material UI would change the class name of their components, and then it would break our tests. When in reality, it didn't change the user behavior. It didn't actually change our app at all, but it broke our tests, and you definitely don't want that occurring. So make sure that you are using stable selectors such as data test attributes, and make sure that you're not coupling your selectors to styles, not using two generic selectors, not coupling it to different things like that. Additionally, Cypress recommends not assigning return values. So we already went over this in the docs here earlier, so we're not going to go there again, but we already discussed that Cypress, it has an asynchronous nature, so it does not run synchronously, and assigning things to return values isn't doing what you expect it to. So you probably shouldn't be using like variables like sci.get and assigning that to a certain variable within your test. It's probably kind of an anti-pattern from Cypress, and it's much better to use just like a .then if you absolutely need to. But as you could see in most of the tests that we wrote here, we actually didn't need to do anything with .thens or stuff like that. We can just use the typical Cypress chaining and everything works just fine there. So try not to assign return values in almost most circumstances. I want to say all circumstances, but I try not to be too kind of all or nothing about things. But Cypress does not run synchronously. All right. And if you need more help there, you can go back to the docs to where we kind of looked at that earlier. And then also, Cypress recommends not testing external sites. So only test websites you can control, and try to avoid testing third-party servers. If you choose, you can use the sci.request that we talked about earlier to talk to third-party servers via their APIs. But if possible, cache the results using a Cypress session to avoid repeat visits. So in Cypress, you can create a session, which you can keep that session active so you don't have to keep calling these external servers. And generally speaking, I think it's a big mistake in your testing to test like external libraries. Like you don't probably need to worry about testing AWS Cognito or testing that a Material UI component works correctly. Like if you just import a Material UI component and you're using that component in isolation without any wrappers around it or additional logic, you probably don't need to go write component tests for that Material UI component. Like you can probably trust that that component is already tested, and the same can be true for using third-party servers and external websites and stuff like that. I would keep your tests within things that you can control rather than trying to do these complex things of testing external sites and stuff like that. Additionally, make sure to keep your tests independent, meaning you don't want one test in your testing suite to rely on another one. This becomes extremely difficult to manage. Trust me. So yes, I do have experience with this. When we were first setting up Cypress, we had some people on our team that were new to Cypress, and I was new to it as well. And we did have some tests in our testing suite, our end-to-end testing suite, in which in one of our tests, we would create a user for our system. And then the following test in our testing suite would expect that user to exist, and it would use that user throughout our tests. However, if the test that created a user failed, it would cause this chain reaction and cause a bunch of other tests to fail. So out of nowhere, we would see like 7 different tests fail, and we wouldn't really like understand why so many tests were failing, but it was because this chain reaction occurred in which one test depended on another, which depended on another. And you definitely don't want to do this. It makes things much more difficult to manage. So make sure that all tests pass in isolation and do not bleed into and affect other tests. You don't want to have your tests have side effects into other tests. And then also, I mentioned this earlier, but don't worry about writing tiny tests. So writing tiny tests like unit tests is non-performant and excessive. This comes straight from Cypress. Cypress resets various states and tests between tests. It takes a long time. So small tests kind of hurt performance because you write a small test and then Cypress has to clean up all that state and do some other things between tests that take a long time. And then it will run another small test and then it'll do all this stuff that takes a long time, then another test. So that can hurt your performance. Plus, within your end-to-end test, you still know exactly what assertion fails. So it's not like just your entire test fails and you don't really know what fails, which if it was a longer test, it would be kind of hard to know. In Cypress, you know exactly what assertion fails. We saw that in our test runner earlier, in which if an assertion fails, we can see what assertion fails. We can go to that line and start debugging there. It's not like we only know that, okay, this test file failed and we have to figure out what failed within it. No, you know the assertion that fails, and that since these small tests can hurt performance and there's more cleanup that occurs between tests and it can take a long time, then it's important to not just focus on writing all these tiny kind of unit tests. And then we also talked about this one a little bit prior, but Cypress recommends that you clean up state before you run tests instead of using like an after each block or something like that, in which they mention don't clean up state with after or after each. One benefit of Cypress is incrementally writing tests and application code. And if the state isn't maintained after a test, it can make it more difficult to know what you should test next. So for example, when I was running our test earlier in our test runner, a test would complete and then I would inspect the DOM and I would look at, okay, what should we test next? But if you're cleaning up all of your state after a test, then when your test stops, it's going to clean everything up and I'm not going to be able to use my application to really know what I should test next. So using these after or after each could get in my way of trying to do that. And then also, if something fails in the middle of a test, the after each cleanup functions won't get a chance to run. And with that, Cypress already cleans things up between tests anyways. So this might not be something you need to worry about at all. So with these points here, if something fails within the test, your after blocks don't get a chance to run. So you should probably do any of this stuff before you start a test anyways. And then also Cypress also already does some cleanup and different state clearing between tests. So you might not need to even worry about writing these different cleanup functions and stuff like that either before or after a test anyway. All right. So generally speaking, try to do like your cleanup and your setup in your before each blocks rather than doing things kind of after a test completes. And then finally, Cypress recommends not to use arbitrary side.waits when possible and to instead use route aliases to do that sort of behavior. So like we talked about earlier, when you are kind of intercepting a route in Cypress, you can give it an alias using .as and then some sort of keyword to kind of name that request. And then later in your test, you can do side.wait, and then you can use the @ symbol and then passing your alias there. And that will effectively wait for that specific request to finish. So instead of just using a arbitrary wait, which can become flaky in those situations, it would be better to use an alias and wait for that specific request to complete by passing in side.wait and then the @ symbol and your alias there. Okay. So those are like 8 different best practices recommended by Cypress. And I do indeed notice right now that I have a spelling error in recommended. Oh, maybe you noticed that the entire time. Maybe I will push a change to the project here so that is fixed, but I'm not going to worry about it too much if you've been with me this entire time. So with that, thank you so much for checking this out. Hopefully you learned a ton about testing your JavaScript applications using Cypress. We covered the fundamentals of Cypress, why you might use it, how to test forms, different examples, component tests, and some best practices here. So like I said, thank you so much for checking this out. I hope to see you in future videos. Make sure to, check out my stuff if you're into that sort of thing, and I will see you some other time here.